Welcome to Living Fully, a podcast dedicated to enhancing your mental well-being. Each episode explores valuable insights and practical strategies to help you lead a more fulfilling life. I'm your host, Katherine Hurtig. In this episode, I talk with social worker Anna Hemens about self-compassion. Anna explains why self-compassion is so important for our mental health and gives some simple tips for how to be more compassionate to ourselves even when we make mistakes. Okay, so today I am here with Anna Hemens, and we are going to talk about self-compassion and the different aspects of that and how it relates to our mental health. Thank you for being here with me, Anna.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is one of my favorite areas to talk about, so thank you for asking me to be here.
Excellent. Well, let's get right into it. Can we talk about, can we define self-compassion? What is it?
Self-compassion, you can break it down into different definitions, but the most basic one is it's being warm and understanding to ourselves, allowing ourselves to be human, accepting ourselves for who we are.
Okay, so with knowing that, how does that tie into kind of our overall mental well-being and our mental health?
I think it's huge, Katherine. Many of us are self-critical, like we have that voice in our head that's always looking for things that we do wrong and mistakes. And self-compassion, I see it as like the antidote to self-criticism, that when we can learn the different techniques and we can change the narrative that we have in our minds about ourselves.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I've worked a lot with self-compassion in my own kind of...
Me too.
Yeah, mental health and counseling. I don't like the word journey, but yeah. It's been huge. So as a mental health counselor, how do you introduce that concept of self-compassion to your clients?
It comes up almost naturally, I think, in sessions with clients, that when, that kind of self-criticism pops up, I help them to just like reframe it and think differently. I like to sometimes show a bit of an image around what self-compassion is and highlight the different parts to it, because there's self-compassion in terms of accepting ourselves and kind of that part of giving our warmth and understanding to who we are and allowing ourselves to be human. But then the other part is also, what action do we take to help to take care of ourselves? And that's actually really hard, right? Like, how do I take care of myself? That means I've got to make decisions for myself. That means I've got to recognize what's healthy for me in my life and what's not healthy for me in my life. I've got to figure out steps I can take forward for my benefit.
Yeah, and that taking care of ourselves, it's not just getting a good night's sleep and, eating a healthy meal. It can be, like you said, making decisions. And sometimes that's like, those are hard and it's not always comfortable, but it is in the long run better for us.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So what role does self-compassion, how do you integrate it into your work with clients?
I think I integrate it into my work with clients sometimes formally by like talking actually about what self-compassion is, and sometimes just in conversation of being able to highlight certain activities or highlight certain parts. For example, boundaries. How often do we talk about boundaries in therapy? I mean, that word must come out of my mouth about 20 times a day, right? And boundaries are self-compassion. So it just kind of like, sometimes it flows into my work. It's not necessarily something like said. It's
not like a conscious choice.
That's it. Yeah. It just kind of like, I think that's because how much I believe in self-compassion, how much I practice self-compassion, it naturally just flows into my work.
Right. You'd mentioned working with clients and kind of building an image. Now, do you mean that literally, like, creating a diagram of the parts of self-compassion, or?
It's an image that I use from a particular source that shows as like an image that helps to show the different parts. But we can absolutely draw that out for the client if necessary.
Okay. What does that look like?
So a common way of seeing self-compassion is that it has these two different parts. The first part is this tender piece about accepting ourselves, being kind to ourselves, supporting ourselves. That's half of it. And the other half is, how can we be fierce for ourselves?
Fierce?
Fierce.
Okay.
Yeah. So how can we like stand up and protect ourselves? How can we push ourselves to kind of get where we want to be, where it's healthy for us to be, right? And so there's an image that kind of that shows that I share with people. And then we break down about what does that look like in your life? So how do we practice this being tender to ourselves? What do we do differently? And what is it about being fierce that you need to do? Is it drawing boundaries? It's recognizing what you need. And how can you access that? How can you recognize and then give yourself what you need? And how can you kind of motivate yourself to kind of push forward and change?
This makes me think of one of my experiences. I literally had a therapy session last night, and we were talking about boundaries and assertiveness. And that made me think of that term you used, fierceness.
Yeah.
And you're right, like working on that. You know, from what you're saying, it sounds like that's an aspect of self-compassion,
Huge.
like standing up for myself, and, you know, in situations where I feel I wasn't respected or something like that.
Yes, because the purpose of a boundary is to protect you. The boundary's not there for anybody else. The boundary is there for you. So it's self-compassion. It's like I'm taking action to protect myself by drawing this boundary. That if somebody says this or somebody does this, here's what I do to protect and take care of me.
Right. So I think in counseling and conversations around mental health, the word self is attached to a lot of different terms, you know, self-love and self-awareness. And, you know, so how does self-compassion, how does it differ from something like self-esteem?
With self-esteem, that's us thinking about where we want to be. Yeah, and it's like who we think that we should be. And this can be really helpful to encourage us to try and to push and experience new events and to build up confidence. So self-esteem is really important. But we're aiming to be different than we are. Self-compassion is accepting who we are right now without any judgment, and taking action to take care of ourselves and then take the steps to grow. But at the same time, we're accepting who we are. So it's not like who I am is not good enough. I've got to get to this place. I've got to push. I've got to do this. It's like, no, this is where I'm at.
Right.
This is the person who I am right now with strengths and weaknesses. This is who I am right now. Okay. And I'm gonna push myself to learn and grow, but I'm accepting at the same time.
Okay.
So it's a very slight difference.
Yeah.
But to me, that's what the difference is. It's not about who we think we should be, but who we are.
Right. Yeah, and I bet that comes up a lot with clients, like, you know, whether they're dealing with depression or, you know, anxiety and those kind of intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. And I think this is like a theme in our society too, is that trying to change who we are, right? And trying to think, this is the person who I should be. That word should drives me nuts. I should do this. I should do that.
Yeah.
I should do this. I should do that, right? Instead of sometimes being like able to see who we are, accept it and love it for the mistakes as well as the successes. Right? Because that's what makes us human. And I think sometimes we almost want to be like machines, you know, let's do everything perfect. Let's do everything great. I want to be different than I am. Well, let's accept who we are right now of being human.
Yeah, I think, and especially like I notice in North American culture, there's always that push to change ourselves. It's like the constant, always wanting to be better and improve. And, you know, on its own, that doesn't sound like a bad thing, but we're okay the way we are. You know, we don't always have to be striving for the next thing. I see that a lot, you know, when it comes to work and careers. You know, there's this mentality that you should always be striving to climb the next rung of the ladder or something.
Yeah.
But you know, whatever role you're playing is still important, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think what happens is we see where we should be and we end up sacrificing ourselves and our mental health to get to where we think we should be. And self-compassion is about understanding where we're at. It's about recognizing how we're feeling and what's happening inside of us. And it's not saying, oh, you don't change and you don't move forward, but it's recognizing in keeping with what's right for you, what's healthy for you.
And we see that so much in media and like definitely social media, that it's like you should always be wanting something different.
Yeah.
To look a different way, to have a different relationship or a relationship period, to have, to have a different life. When, I think we should probably be striving just to love the life we're living. I don't know.
Yeah. But how hard that is, because that's the opposite to what we're told. And think about things like body image. It's the same there, of being like trying, I shouldn't be this way. I should be a different way. I should push myself, instead of like giving compassion and love to our bodies, of being able to recognize, like, thank you, my heart for beating every day, right?
Yeah.
Like, thank you for the strength that you have to get out of bed every day. Thank you for the strength you have to walk with me to the sea. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's giving that gratitude and that love instead of that kind of criticism. And that's self-compassion.
I could go on for hours about that idea, about like body image. I think it's ridiculous. Like, the message is that, all people, but women in particular, I think, and it feels so arbitrary sometimes. It's like, you know what? Like, the way your eyebrows are shaped actually isn't ideal. And you should be doing, XYZ to change that. This is mad.
It is. And the impact social media has on that. And I think maybe this is something we should talk about in a future podcast, Katherine.
Yes, please.
Because I think I could talk about this too for a really long time, and trying to shift that perception and that view which we get from childhood, from our peers, from the images that we see, the movies that we see. I'm 40. And so when I look back at the movies that I grew up watching, everybody has like the perfect body, right? Yeah. Like, everybody, you think about Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that, like that's the male perception, but kind of muscular, very fit. And that was the image that was given to me with movies that I watched growing up. So yeah, it's a good topic, Katherine, but I think it might take
I know. Well, a bit of a detour.
But a relevant one.
Yes.
Like, self-compassion isn't about changing the way I think. It's about adding something different. And it's about accepting all of us, right? Bodies, our lives, all of those different pieces, and giving that love and that compassion.
So this author, Kristin
Neff, Neff. Mm-hmm.
Is she a psychologist? Is she?
Yep. So self-compassion has been around, like, if you think about like different religions and pieces like that, like self-compassion has been around for a very, very long time. But Kristin Neff really brought it into kind of an easier way to conceptualize and use, and linking it with our kind of current lifestyles. Yeah,
like, I liked how it was broken down into kind of 3 parts. So it's, like you said, the kindness, like, to ourselves, and then the aspect of like common humanity.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
So there's 3 different parts that Kristin Neff defines self-compassion as. The first part is mindfulness. So that's really knowing what's happening in ourselves. So for example, somebody says something and you're uncomfortable. It makes you feel uncomfortable. It's recognizing that. It's feeling like, oh, this is making me uncomfortable. Then that can help to guide, okay, what's the reason for that? So being mindful about ourselves and in our internal environment. There's being kind to ourselves that we've talked about. And the third part is this common humanity. And what that means for me is about normalizing being human.
Yeah.
We're not alone. And I say this a lot, and I've probably said it like 3 or 4 times already since we've been talking about like being human and allowing ourselves to be human. We mess up. Sometimes we say things that we don't mean because we're tired, or we're hungry. And sometimes, we fall over, we break things, all different kinds of pieces. We're human beings.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty. We are the complex, loving creatures, but we're not perfect.
Right.
And so that's how I see the common humanity piece.
In my own experiences, that idea has been really significant. I'm really conscious of my words because, like, after listening back to these, I'm like, look at all these filler words that I say.
Well, self-compassion.
It's true. Yeah,
because it doesn't sound that way. Because it doesn't sound that way to me. It just sounds like a natural conversation.
Self-compassion. What was I saying? Yeah, in my own experiences, that common humanity concept has been really significant because, when struggling with like depression and anxiety, I think a lot of people, and myself included, feel very alone in that experience.
Yep.
And that couldn't be further from the truth. Like, those feelings are very common. So kind of knowing that it makes the experience a bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And also for times when it's like recognizing if something's really hard. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific example and I can't think of one, but like when you're going through a really hard time, being able to recognize that that's how other people would find it too, right? Like, yeah, right. This is tough for you. This would be tough for, and I say this a lot to my clients, you know, like beating themselves up about, you know, finding something difficult. And I'm like, well, of course it's difficult. You've got this, and this going on in your life.
Yeah.
Like this is really hard. And so that's that kind of normalizing and the same with depression. You do feel alone with both depression and anxiety, but it's recognizing, no, you're not. Other people go through this too. Mm-hmm. And that's not to minimize your experience. But it's just to say other people go through this too.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've kind of talked about how self-compassion connects in when it comes to depression and anxiety. Are there other kind of mental health concerns or other reasons that people come to you for counseling where self-compassion can help?
I think it helps in I see everybody about anything. And I would say self-compassion fits everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, so you're coming because it's difficult for you to make a decision at the moment in your life. Self-compassion fits in there. You're coming because you're having a hard time. Body image, self-compassion fits in there. You know, you're feeling worried, anxious, self-compassion fits there. I don't think there's anywhere where self-compassion doesn't fit.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, it's not like, you know, oh, in this situation, it's not a good idea to be kind to yourself.
Yeah, no, that doesn't ever fit.
So when you're working with clients, how do you suggest building that skill or introducing the idea of self-compassion if it's something that they're not familiar with or haven't really tried before?
So first, I think I would talk about how hard self-compassion is. Because it's the opposite to how many of us have lived for a long time. Like most of us have that bully in our heads, has that part of us that's always looking for mistakes, right? And maybe
when it's like that conditioned, it's really hard to change that thought pattern, those behaviors.
Yeah. And I've had some people that have said to me, well, Anna, I've never really been given any understanding and love in my life. So how do I give that to myself? Right?
Yeah.
Like it can be a hard piece to introduce. So when we're talking, I guess it sounds quite simple and quite easy, but actually like everything else, when you start putting it in, it's tough, right? Like it helps 100%, but it's a different way than we're used to. So I normalize that, common humanity, right? I normalize that. In terms of how to use self-compassion in our lives, one way I think is about like being your own supportive coach. Now, there are supportive coaches, there are not supportive coaches. If I can give you a little bit of a sports metaphor kind of thing here. So I don't know much about hockey, so I apologize if any of this is incorrect.
I don't either.
Okay. So from what I remember from social media last year, there were two different hockey teams that had two very different style of coaches. One had a coach that basically picked on them on the team's like errors and their mistakes, and nothing was ever good enough for this coach, right? What happened to that team? They tanked. Another team had a coach who really was the opposite, right? That really kind of was, you know, they're amazing, they're fantastic. I mean, didn't literally say those words, but was really focusing on their strengths.
Yeah.
What happened? They ended up being in the playoffs, and that wasn't what people had expected from that team. So I'm not saying it's completely down to the coaching, but that just made me think about like two different types of coaches that we have. Right? Like some look at the failures and some look at the strengths. The ones that look at our strengths are the ones that get the best results. And so how self-compassion can be like being our own supportive coach, right? Like, oh yeah, I know this is hard, this is tough, but that's okay. Tomorrow's another day, right? Or, you know, I know this is hard, this is tough, but you can do it, right? I believe in you. Like being able to give that kind of encouragement. I know it seems almost like weird and unfamiliar, but how natural this can actually become, that we start to speak in that way, in a different way to ourselves, to kind of, have our own back, right? Quite often people say that about the value of having a relationship where somebody has your back. Well, how can you have your own back, right? How can you be your own kind of supportive coach? A common strategy is like, what would you say to a friend? Saying that to yourself. So I think I probably say that to a number of clients every week about like, so, you know, what would you say to your child if you had a child? Like, what would you say to your child? What would you say to your friend? then how can you say that to yourself? And I sometimes get surprised looks of being like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, like, how can you say that? How different is that to what you would normally say to yourself?
And it's probably a bit awkward to kind of start thinking and, quote unquote, speaking to ourselves that way. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of get over that hump? Do you just,
I think,
do it anyway?
Well, I think you already do. Like, I get like talking out loud to yourself, maybe, but yeah, I do that. Right? Like, I think there's a conversation that's happening in our mind quite often. We're just kind of like bringing it more forward and seeing it. Yeah. And so I think, how do we do it? We do it through practice. So be it at the end of the day when you're journaling about something that's been really hard for you that day, then do you practice some self-compassion, right? In the moment when you start to practice that mindfulness of being aware of what's happening for you, how do you then support yourself? This is really scary right now. Right? And there's dedicated techniques that you can do, but I think a part of it is just being able to recognize the difference in how you react to yourself.
I had a counselor once give this really great metaphor or analogy about making these kinds of changes. And they talked about, like, when you go sledding on a snowy hill, and then you go back up the hill and you go down again, and that the sled kind of, it makes a track. And so it's a lot easier to go down that same track over and over. Yep. But when we want to change the way we think or behave, initially it's like taking the sled on that untouched snow that doesn't have the track in it yet. Yeah. And, the first few times it might be a little bumpy, a little uncomfortable, but like the more you do it, the more that's ingrained and the easier it gets.
I love that. And that's true, like anatomically as well, like biologically as well. Our brains are neuroplastic. What does that mean? That they change, and we can focus and build our brains in different ways. So just because we've been focusing one way, you can kind of change that. Right? I find that really empowering.
Me too. I love that.
We don't have to be fixed in a certain way. When in these times where we don't feel like we have any power, I'm like, you can change your brain. Yeah. Right? Like you really can. And even though it's uncomfortable, as you said, like it's untouched snow to begin with, the more that we do it, the other benefit, again, back to biology, is it actually activates our caregiving system in our brain and releases like oxytocin, the love feeling, right? So biologically, that link between brain and body, right? How we actually get a response from treating ourselves kindly.
In your experience, when someone starts practicing self-compassion and builds that into their life, does that translate into the relationship with other people?
Yeah.
Like, does it improve relationships? Are people kinder to others?
I mean, I wouldn't say, because every single client who I see is an individual and every case is different. But when we practice self-compassion, it can change our relationships in different ways depending upon the nature of the relationships. The big part that it changes is our relationship with ourselves. But relationships with others, I think if we can learn to draw the boundaries, to recognize what's healthy for us and what's not healthy for us in relationships, that leads to healthier, more supportive relationships.
Right. I remember, a few episodes back, you were on talking about healthy boundaries. That made me think of that.
Yeah, that's why I volunteer for that with self-compassion. You see, it's just like, it spreads out.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So we kind of touched on this before, but I'm interested in your thoughts. So I don't want to say that these ideas are like a dichotomy or like, against each other, but, we live in a world with high expectations and pressures and, we talked about the idea of improvement and change and growth. So how do we strike a balance between having self-compassion and acceptance, but also striving to be better?
That's a really important question, Katherine. And I think how we strike that balance is by connecting with ourselves and the impact that the way that we are living our lives has on us. So, for example, with expectations, if our expectations are unrealistic and are way above what is actually healthy for us, and yet we keep pushing and pushing and pushing ourselves, what does that lead to? Self-criticism.
Yeah.
And exhaustion and anxiety. Whereas if we can set like expectations that are understanding of our humanity that are like, okay, this is where I'd like to be, right? It's very different. I think that's what the balance is. It's about recognizing the impact that the way that you're living is having upon you and your mental health, and then looking at ways in which you can change that in keeping with self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of a specific example. I'm not very good at specific examples, it would seem. Okay. But
you are good at the metaphors, though. I remember your one about the garden.
Oh yeah, with boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah. And I also think about that idea of like pushing ourselves and where do we find the happy medium with self-compassion. It comes down to that idea of like who we think we should be versus who we want to be. So this is one of my key kind of thoughts in my mind is should, turn it into want. I should do this. I want to do this.
Okay.
Right? So it changes how we perceive it. The should is the expectation. The want, well, that's listening to me. And that's listening to actually what I want in my life.
Yeah.
And how I therefore approach it is different.
How do you work with clients? How do you tell them how to build a practice of self-compassion? Are there any, little tips and tricks that our audience can start using?
So one of the first ways is that idea about mindfulness and us learning about ourselves and what's happening for us as people is actually start checking in. Right? That's what I call it. I call it a daily check-in of almost like throughout the day, when you have your morning coffee, when you have your lunch or your food at lunchtime, any breaks you have during the day, literally take like 10, 20 seconds and just say to yourself, how am I doing? And it's really interesting. When you do that, you're sitting like, oh, I'm hungry. Haven't eaten for the past like 5 or 6 hours, or I'm feeling really sad right now. I wonder why that is, or I'm exhausted. Oh, maybe then I should make a change to what I've got planned for the afternoon, right? So if we check in with ourselves, that can help us to then make decisions based with self-compassion, looking at what we need and what's happening for us.
Yeah.
But that's really hard. We spend our lives focused on other people and things outside of us, right? So learning, and it's just literally 10 or 20 seconds, just as I've demonstrated there, it takes just checking in. How am I doing? Asking yourself that. Right? And listening to the answer. And then maybe that might help you to think about changes that you can make throughout the day.
So what I've heard about mindfulness is a really sitting with and accepting whatever feeling you're experiencing. And these examples that you brought up in that check-in, like, oh, I'm feeling a bit sad. For like, let's take that for an example. Mm-hmm. It's not a nice feeling to go through. So I don't know. I struggle with that idea of sitting with that emotion and not resisting it. How do we do that?
There's no nice. There's not like good or bad emotions. This is like a perception that we've put on them, right? That there are these positives and these negatives, and it's just being like, no, this is what's here. It's not good. It's not bad. What do I need?
Right. Yeah.
I'm feeling sad right now. That sucks.
I like that. That mindset, just recognizing it, and what's that telling you? What do you need?
And that takes us away from being human if we try not, that common humanity in that moment, to not experience all of being human, right? Like, oh, no, you can only feel the happy emotions. You can't, and it's like, but you're human.
Yeah.
Right? Like a dog gets sad. A dog gets happy. Well, they do, right? Like, this is all just kind of part of living. And I think part of us tries to not truly live, right? And it's like, no, that's... And if I work with kids, I'll say something like, sad is not bad. I'll turn it into a little bit of a rhyme, right? Like, sad is not bad.
Yeah.
Right? Like, show your experience. Acknowledge your experience.
Yeah.
With no judgment.
Yeah, like those feelings. I mean, it might not always be enjoyable, but it is part of that human experience. Yeah. And you're not really going through it all if you don't feel all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sad is not bad.
Sad is not bad. And the other piece in terms of like strategies for people, something that sits with me is about how often in our lives we rely upon or we like validation from other people. So external validation, right? Somebody else telling you, oh, you did great at that, right? And how that helps us. It's almost like we believe the words of other people more than our own experience.
Which when you say it out loud, it sounds silly, but yeah, I'm so guilty of it.
We all are. And so in terms of like a strategy or something, it's almost like, how can you give yourself the internal validation? So how can you say these things to yourself instead of needing to hear them from somebody else?
Right.
Right. So how can you say, yeah, that was tough. You did good.
Yeah.
Right. Because something that self-compassion helps us to do is to continue to face some uncomfortable moments. So here's an example, right? Like I give a presentation at work, and that kind of self-critical part of me is just looking for what I did wrong. I mumbled. I didn't say things clearly. I said the words wrong. I wasn't stood up straight. How likely am I to feel comfortable doing it again?
Yeah, not likely.
Whereas if I can say, that was really tough, right? Like that was really hard. But look, you did it. You got through the whole thing. And maybe there are a couple of pieces that you were not as good as others, but you still got through the entire thing. I'm proud of you. Then how likely are you to do it again?
Yes, much more likely.
Right? So that's kind of the difference of, how we can change the way that we see certain things.
So Anna, can you talk about any societal factors that might play a role or influence the way we perceive and practice self-compassion?
Absolutely. One of the ones that stands out the most to me is this idea that self-compassion is selfish. And I do hear this from my clients, like that can be the way that it can be perceived. And selfish to me is lacking consideration for other people, like not having regard for other people.
Yeah.
And so does accepting yourself and taking care of your needs mean that you have no regard for other people? Right? It's not like an either or an or.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an and.
Yeah.
Right? It's being able to say, you're really important in my life. Like, I really care about you and I need to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's for my own well-being. It's not an either or an or, it's an and. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, taking care of yourself and what you need doesn't mean you're not going to take care of your kids, take care of your friends.
Yeah. Doesn't mean that you don't value other people. Doesn't mean you don't have regard for other people. It's the same as like, I've seen a thing that it said, if self-care is selfish, if being assertive is aggressive, if being confident is arrogance, then your comfort zone is not a good indicator. And so what that means is that we sometimes think, no, I can't be assertive because it's aggressive.
Yeah.
Right? Or I can't be confident because that just means that I'm arrogant. Or self-care is selfish. Really? Right? Like your comfort zone, like the idea of like what we're familiar with isn't necessarily a good indicator, right? And it's the same here with like self-compassion. Self-compassion is selfish, right? No. So I feel that's a really important message, that self-compassion is the opposite of selfish.
Completely. Yeah. Thinking about like that common humanity aspect of it, how can like an individual kind of encourage, a culture of self-compassion, whether that's in their families or workplaces or communities?
Yeah. I think a part of that is almost like role modeling self-compassion, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like when you see that somebody, your daughter comes home from school and her grades are not like perfect, or they're not like, and she's upset, then you can be able to validate that to help her to accept, okay, yeah, I can see that you're upset about getting these results, but you tried your best. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Right? And thank you for bringing these results to me. And congratulations in trying so hard. Right?
Those messages are probably super important when it comes to younger children, right?
Yeah. Right? So instead of having these expectations that as children we learn to meet and that continues into our adulthood, it's congratulating them, right? It's pointing out the positives, not pointing out the negatives, right? Like treating themselves like that supportive kind of coach.
Yeah.
Right? And I would say that goes into other relationships too, of just like your husband unloads the dishwasher, right? And so you acknowledge that, right? And you say, thank you so much for doing that. That's not quite but it's almost like that idea of acknowledging the positives in somebody and helping them to feel good about themselves.
Well, yeah, and it can start with something little like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think it's just modeling that understanding and that acceptance to them. So when they're feeling critical about themselves, how can you show them a different way?
At least I unloaded the dishwasher.
Yeah.
And I could see that being really applicable in workplaces as well, like a leader kind of modeling self-compassion. Yeah. And like you said, in like, that team setting, compassion probably leads to better results. So.
Yeah. And I think in terms of like a leader, part of that is also acknowledging their experience, So if a leader is able to say, this is tough, like getting these sales targets this month, I know this is really hard, right? Like actually acknowledging that, I think is a, because then that's kind of like that common humanity. It's like acknowledging that this is hard or whatever.
Right.
Or acknowledging their own experience of being like, I found this incredibly, this was tough for us today. But like acknowledging their own experience.
Yeah. As we kind of wrap up, are there any like key takeaways or pieces of advice you'd like to offer our listeners about self-compassion?
Being your own supportive coach, right? Like treating yourself the way that you would treat somebody else and learning how we can take care of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. Thanks for this great chat.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Centre podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was produced by Nick here, Louisa Campos, and by me, Katherine Hurtig. A special thanks to Anna Hemens. To stay up to date on our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe. We're available in your favorite podcast app. Living Fully is a production of Calgary Counseling Centre and recorded in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Living Fully podcast is not a substitute or alternative for professional care or treatment. Calgary Counseling Centre and Counseling Alberta provide effective counseling for anyone in Alberta with no waitlist and no financial barriers. Find us online at calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. For help across Canada and the United States, call 211. If you are outside of Canada and the US, seek help from your general medical practitioner.